a millionaire abandons his newborn daughter at an orphanage. Years later, after a severe accident leaves him paralyzed, he depends on a doctor to survive, unaware of the devastating secret she holds. In today's video, we'll follow the emotional story of a man who made a drastic choice and now must face the consequences. By focusing on success, he left his daughter behind, but fate has prepared an unexpected twist. Stay until the end to discover how this encounter will transform their lives in unimaginable ways. What will he do when he learns the truth? Collins Manor in the heart of London was shrouded in a suffocating silence. Dark curtains blocked out the sunlight, leaving the grand living room almost in shadow. Richard Collins, a man whose life was once defined by stability and success, now seemed a mere shadow of himself. He sat in an opulent armchair, clutching a worn photograph of Evelyn, his deceased wife. She had died during childbirth just weeks ago, leaving behind not only Richard, but also a newborn daughter. The crib was placed beside the armchair, and the little girl slept peacefully, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions her father faced. Richard, however, could not bring himself to look at her. The weight of responsibility crushed him in a way he had never felt before. His hands trembled as he traced the edge of the photograph, feeling as if his connection to Evelyn was slipping away. He knew deep down that this child needed him, but all he could feel was a devastating failure. A father incapable of loving his own daughter, of caring for her after losing the love of his life. The clock on the wall ticked heavily, each tick sounding like a hammer in his mind. Time was passing, and with every minute, Richard sank deeper into his sadness and impotence. He stood up, his eyes misty, and slowly walked toward the crib. He looked at his daughter, but instead of seeing an innocent child, he saw a reflection of his loss. He knew he couldn't do this. He couldn't be the father she needed. With red-rimmed eyes, he made a decision that would change their lives forever. Taking the baby into his arms, Richard took a deep breath. Every step toward the door was a challenge. He walked as if entering a journey from which there would be no return. The orphanage, located on the outskirts of London, felt like a reflection of Richard's inner turmoil, a place worn by time, cold and distant. He parked his car and sat for a few minutes, gathering courage. Finally, he got out and walked to the entrance, the baby in his arms, with heavy steps. The director, a woman with a stern demeanor and firm gestures, greeted him with a look that mixed curiosity and suspicion. She guided him to a small sitting room where papers and documents awaited on the table. With a fixed gaze on the papers, Richard signed the necessary documents to formalize the relinquishment of his daughter, feeling the weight of his decision grow with each stroke of the pen. With a swift, decisive movement, he pulled a check from his suit pocket and handed it to the director, a considerable donation to ensure that his daughter would have what she needed. "This should cover all her needs," he said, his voice choked. The director took the check, raising an eyebrow as she noted the amount before returning her gaze to Richard and the baby in his arms. "Is there truly no one else in the family?" she asked, her tone hinting at surprise. Richard shook his head. No close relatives or friends who could care for her. My wife passed away recently, and there's no one else." The director regarded him, seeing beyond his serious demeanor. She noticed the tremor in his hands and the anguish in his gaze. "Are you sure, sir? Raising a child can be difficult, but abandoning one is not something easily borne." Richard swallowed hard, her words echoing in his mind. He struggled to hide how he was crumbling inside. "I know. It's best for her. Someone here can give her what I cannot." An uncomfortable silence settled in the room as Richard took one last look at his daughter. He knew this would be the final moment. His expression hardened as he held the baby in his arms for just 1 second longer, fighting to find the courage for the next step. Finally, he took a deep breath and handed her over to the director, who cradled her with care. Richard could not say anything more. His words failed him, as if the pain was blocking his voice. As he turned to leave, the baby's cries echoed through the room. It was the first time he had heard his daughter cry since her birth. The sound hit him like a blade. Richard froze for a moment, feeling the pain cut through his chest like a punch. He closed his eyes, struggling against the urge to turn back. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to stay, to take his daughter back into his arms and run from that place. But he kept walking, his legs heavy and his mind in turmoil. If he stopped, he knew he would never find the courage to leave her. The road leading back from the orphanage to central London seemed endless. The sky was gray and the heavy clouds reflected Richard's internal state. He drove his car with firm hands on the wheel, but his heart felt like it was sinking further with each kilometer. The silence in the car was deafening, but his mind was filled with silent screams of regret and sorrow. As he accelerated down the rural road, tears began to flow involuntarily. He had tried to hold them back, but now reality hit him with full force. The loss of Evelyn had already been an unbearable pain. Now he had abandoned his daughter, the last link he had to his wife. Richard tried to convince himself that it was best for the girl, that she would be cared for by people more capable than him, but the words echoed hollow in his mind. Each kilometer felt like an eternity, and with every second, the image of his daughter's cries resonated in his thoughts. He pressed on the accelerator, as if fleeing from his own regret could be a solution. But deep down he knew something precious had been lost at that orphanage. Regret swelled, making each breath more difficult, more burdensome. He wanted to stifle what he felt, to bury it deeply, but he couldn't escape the sense that he had just made the worst decision of his life. The road ahead remained empty, reflecting Richard's isolation. He was alone, more than ever, driving away from the only person who could give him a reason to keep going. The weight of guilt now mingled with the loss of Evelyn, and the void in his heart expanded with each minute. But would he have the strength to face the consequences of this choice? And what would become of his daughter's future? Richard moved forward, but what he didn't know was that the decision he had just made would bring consequences far greater than he could ever imagine. Years had passed since Richard Collins had abandoned his daughter at the orphanage. He had become a successful businessman, one of the most respected in London. His office, located at the top of an imposing skyscraper, reflected the greatness he had achieved. He commanded a multinational corporation with precision, every detail under his control. The facade he presented was that of a man who had conquered everything he set out to do, but inside, Richard carried a void that no amount of money or prestige could fill. That morning, Richard sat behind his desk, a pile of contracts in front of him. He signed documents with the same efficiency as always, but his thoughts were distant. He stood up and walked to the glass wall, looking out at the city sprawling below. The lights of London sparkled. The traffic flowed like a constant stream of life following its course. To anyone looking from the outside, Richard Collins had the world in his hands. But there, with the city at his feet, he felt trapped in his own emotional prison. The success he had built with such fervor did not fill the hole he felt in his heart. There was something no one knew about Richard, an absence he had never mentioned, the daughter he had abandoned. None of his friends, colleagues, or even the few distant family members knew about that terrible decision. The subject was buried as deeply as the pain he carried. As he gazed at the vastness of the city, Richard reflected on the emptiness consuming him. He had built an empire, but somewhere along the way, something fundamental was missing. Thoughts of his daughter surfaced from time to time, but he always pushed them away. However, now, with years of distance, that feeling was impossible to ignore. His life was filled with wealth but empty of meaning. Later that day, Richard found himself in the company's meeting room, a space as luxurious as his office, adorned with marble tables and leather chairs. The investors sat in a semicircle before him, all eagerly awaiting the presentation. Richard was used to situations like this. Meetings like this were routine for him. He began to speak, highlighting the company's growth, impressive numbers that astonished even the most skeptical and infallible plans for international expansion. Praise started to flow, and Richard responded with his usual calculated calm until one of the investors, an older man with a friendly tone, made a casual remark. "Mr. Collins, what I admire most about your work is how you've built a true legacy. Family is everything, and what you've created here will certainly last for generations." The words family and legacy hit Richard like a direct blow. His rehearsed speech was interrupted by a moment of silence. No matter how hard he tried to disguise it, the words echoed in the room and within his mind. In an instant, he was transported back to the orphanage, to the moment he left his daughter in the director's arms without looking back. The knot in his throat resurfaced, and for a brief moment, he lost himself in his own thoughts. Richard took a deep breath, trying to regain control, but the words continued to reverberate in his head. Family. He was a man who had everything except what truly mattered. The weight of his daughter's absence, which he had tried so hard to suppress, resurfaced relentlessly. What he had achieved up to that point seemed insignificant in light of what he had left behind. He blinked a few times, forcing himself to return to the present. "Thank you," he replied robotically, resuming his presentation with a slightly wavering voice. But at that moment it became clear to Richard that the financial success he had pursued for years now felt hollow. His legacy was incomplete, and this reality hit him with a force he had not expected. Later that night, Richard was back at the mansion. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the wind against the windows. He dined alone at a long, dark wooden table, with empty seats around him. The luxury surrounding him felt irrelevant as he mechanically cut his food, lacking flavor or appetite. The silence that once offered a sense of control now felt suffocating. After pushing his plate aside, unable to eat, he stood up from the table and began to walk through the mansion's corridors. The walls were adorned with paintings, old photographs capturing moments from his past. He paused in front of a photo of Evelyn, taken during a trip they had to Paris. Her smile seemed so distant now, almost an echo of a happiness he would never be able to reach again. It was then that, without warning, the face of his daughter, still a baby, appeared in his mind. Her cries, the image of when he handed her over to the orphanage, the weight of that moment crushed him in a way he could no longer ignore. Memories came flooding back like an avalanche, and Richard felt his legs give way. He sank to the floor, leaning against the wall, his face buried in his hands. The years of emotional restraint, of hardness and denial, crumbled in that moment. For the first time in a long time, Richard allowed the tears to fall freely. The pride he had nurtured gave way to an overwhelming regret. The loss of Evelyn had always been a constant pain, but now he felt her absence with a renewed intensity. He had abandoned her, justifying to himself that it was for the best. But now, alone in that vast, silent house, he knew something precious had been lost, and perhaps it was too late to reclaim it. As the tears rolled down, he faced the emptiness of his own existence. The man who had remained steadfast and impenetrable for years finally surrendered to the pain he had been avoiding. The solitude he chose and built around himself devoured him completely, leaving only the question he did not want to confront. Would he still have the courage to seek out the daughter he had abandoned all those years ago? And what would he find upon doing so? If you're enjoying this story filled with emotion and twists, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's really important for the growth of the channel and helps us continue bringing more impactful stories for you. Now let's continue with the story. Richard's silent mansion seemed to suffocate him, filling every corner of his mind with the weight of regret. He needed an escape, a way to leave behind the emptiness that consumed him. In a sudden impulse, he grabbed his car keys and drove aimlessly, leaving the bustling streets of London for a deserted rural road. With each kilometer he covered, he pressed the accelerator harder, as if speed could drown out the memories and guilt that now surfaced mercilessly. The wind cut through the silence, and the roar of the engine seemed like a release valve for the whirlpool of thoughts in his mind. But the faster he drove, the more thoughts of his daughter invaded his head. He felt a tightening in his chest, his breath becoming heavy and labored. The image of his daughter left behind in the orphanage, the sound of her crying as he turned to walk away, the void of his life now. Everything blended together, creating a burden he could no longer bear. "Who have I become?" he murmured, his gaze fixed on the road. No matter how much success he had accumulated, it all felt meaningless. Abandoning his daughter seemed like an irreparable mistake, a wound he had ignored until it was too late. He wondered if he truly deserved everything he had achieved. The truth struck him. He was an empty man, trapped in a facade of success and power he could no longer uphold. Suddenly, his vision blurred, images overlapping like a fast-forwarded film in his mind, and he didn't notice the obstacle ahead until it was too late. With a sudden jerk, he tried to swerve but lost control. The car spun violently, rolling over several times as Richard was thrown against the seatbelt. The world spun around him in a mix of sound and pain until, finally, everything fell silent. His body lay still among the wreckage, his mind numb and heart racing, while an absolute darkness enveloped him. Hours passed, but Richard had no sense of time. He awoke in a cold, sterile white room, feeling pressure in his chest and intense pain radiating throughout his body. He tried to move, but it felt as if his body wouldn't obey him. His arms and legs seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He attempted to sit up, but in a moment of pure terror, he realized he was trapped, paralyzed. A nurse entered the room, noticing Richard's frightened gaze. Her expression was professional, yet had a hint of concern as she adjusted the equipment around him. "Mr. Collins, you're in the hospital," she said softly. "You suffered an accident, and there was serious damage to your spine." Richard looked at her, then at his own hands, trying to move them, but failing. "I can't move," he whispered hoarsely. The nurse averted her gaze before gently explaining, "The accident caused a spinal injury. For now you are paralyzed, but we will do our best to help you adapt." Her words felt like a sentence. The man who had always believed he was in control of his life now had no control over his own body. The weight of despair crashed down on him. For the first time, he realized how much his physical strength had been the foundation of his identity. What did his wealth, power, and empire mean now? None of it mattered, not without the ability to move, to walk, to live as he once did. He turned to stare at the white ceiling of the hospital, feeling crushed by the hopelessness that consumed him. A complete sense of emptiness filled his being. The facade of self-sufficiency he had maintained for years was crumbling. He was a broken man, with no one to whom he could turn for help. No close friends, no family, only a past of choices that now stared back at him. Richard forced himself to take a deep breath, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. He realized that for the first time, he was entirely dependent on others. There was no room left for pride or arrogance. And as he faced the brutal reality of his situation, an image invaded his mind. The daughter he had abandoned. The pain of his own loneliness now felt like an echo of that decision, as if fate was forcing him to experience the vulnerability he had left behind by abandoning her. Days turned into weeks, and Richard barely recognized the person he saw in the mirror of his hospital room. His eyes were sunken, his face pale and worn. The man who had always prided himself on his imposing appearance now looked like a defeated man, trapped in a bed, devoid of hope. Everything seemed irreversible, each moment a reminder of what he had lost. Then Camille entered his life. She was a young doctor, with a calm demeanor and a patience he didn't understand. Camille treated him with a kindness that disarmed any resistance he attempted to raise. She cared for him as if he were not merely a patient, but someone important, someone deserving of attention. In the first days, Richard spoke little, but her presence became a constant he began to long for. "All right, Mr. Collins, time for physical therapy," Camille would say with an encouraging smile, while adjusting his pillow and preparing the exercises that could help him regain movement. She encouraged him, even on days when he was most resistant. The serene and calm tone of her voice seemed to penetrate the thick layer of bitterness Richard had built around himself. One afternoon, during a therapy session, Camille noticed Richard's lost expression and approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you thinking about something?" Her question was careful, as if she understood the topic was delicate. Richard hesitated, feeling uncomfortable discussing himself, but something about her presence made him want to open up. "I was thinking about choices, things from the past that I perhaps should have done differently." Camille nodded, not pressing him. "We all have things we wish we had done differently, but life, well, it doesn't always give us a second chance." Her response, simple and sincere, touched him deeply. He felt a strange weight in his chest, a mix of regret and hope. Something about the way Camille spoke to him, the way she looked at him without judgment, awakened a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. She saw him not as a businessman or a millionaire, but as Richard, an ordinary, vulnerable person. As the days passed, each time Camille entered the room, he felt a calm he couldn't explain. There was an inexplicable connection between them, a sense of comfort that made him yearn for the brief conversations they shared. He began to talk more about himself, slowly revealing the fears and regrets he would never have admitted to anyone else. Little did Richard know he was, piece by piece, drawing closer to the daughter he had abandoned years ago. Unbeknownst to him, Camille was helping him confront parts of himself he had tried to avoid. And as the connection between them grew, fate seemed to be preparing the way for a revelation that would change both of their lives. But what if the truth that Richard has avoided for so long is now closer than he imagines? How will he cope when he discovers that Camille is, in fact, the daughter he so deeply mourns having lost? Camille's office was a small refuge in the hospital, a calm space where she and Richard engaged in conversations that transcended medical matters. Over the weeks, Richard had set aside his reservations and began to speak more openly. He felt an inexplicable trust in Camille. There was something about her that made him feel at home, a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. "It's not easy," he said, adjusting himself in the wheelchair, "losing someone who meant everything to you. Evelyn was everything I had." He averted his gaze, his voice heavy. "But, well, I guess after so many years, I should be used to the idea of loss." Camille listened in silence, absorbing every word. She felt something strange, an inexplicable connection drawing her in. It was as if, somehow, his pain was also hers. The young doctor tried to remain composed, but hearing about Evelyn made her feel a weight in her chest that she couldn't explain. Her biological mother had also been an absent figure in her life, someone she knew very little about. Richard noticed the slight tremor in her expression. "I'm sorry, maybe I've said too much," he murmured, regretful. Camille shook her head quickly. "No, please continue," she urged sincerely. There was something important he hadn't mentioned yet, and she felt the need to know more. Even without understanding why, listening to Richard's life story sparked a mix of comfort and sadness within her. They continued to talk, but she noticed he avoided touching on a specific point, an almost palpable absence in his narrative. Could it be about children? At the end of the session, Camille walked to the door, and Richard watched her leave. He felt a space she occupied in his life now, something he never thought would exist again. He couldn't explain where that connection came from, but he couldn't help but notice how familiar she seemed. A few days later, on an ordinary afternoon, Camille found herself in the hospital archives, rummaging through old files she cherished. When she opened one of the folders containing scant records of her life, she stumbled upon a note that surprised her. It was the name of her biological mother, Evelyn Collins, the same name Richard had mentioned in one of their recent conversations. She reread the file, her eyes wide. Could it be just a coincidence? She thought. hastily flipping through the pages as if each line were a piece of a puzzle. Her mind resisted connecting the dots, but the dates matched and the details did too. Her heart raced as she recalled that her biological father's name was Richard. Her hands trembled as she began to flip through another file that confirmed her biological father's full name, Richard Collins. The ground seemed to disappear beneath her feet. It was him. Richard, the patient for whom she had begun to develop an inexplicable affection, was the same man who had abandoned her as a baby. The revelation hit her with full force. The air felt thin. She dropped the papers and stood there in silence, feeling the impact of the truth spreading inside her. She struggled to comprehend what she felt: anger, disillusionment, and at the same time an inexplicable sense of connection. Richard was here, and they had met through an inexplicable force of destiny. But how could she face him now, knowing that the man who had abandoned her was within reach, trusting her without having the slightest idea of who she truly was? Camille left the archives and walked through the hospital in a daze. Each step was a conflict. She wanted to confront him, to ask why he had done it, why he had left her behind. But the affection she had developed over the past few days made her hesitate. She felt torn, her heart oscillating between hurt and a bond she couldn't seem to break. That night, Camille decided to go to Richard's room. She needed to resolve the doubts that tormented her, but she wanted to do it carefully. There were questions she needed to ask without immediately revealing her true identity. She was determined to confirm everything before making a final confrontation. When she entered the room, Richard immediately noticed that she seemed restless. Camille approached slowly and asked, her voice soft, trying to control her anxiety, "Richard, have you ever thought about children?" It was a direct question, but she hoped the answer might give her a clue about his feelings. Richard, caught off guard, fell silent for a moment. His expression hardened slightly, and he turned his face away. "Camille, that's a complicated story," he said, his voice low, almost as if it were a secret. "I've lost people I loved, and I made mistakes. Big mistakes." Camille remained calm, but her heart raced. "Do you think those mistakes can be corrected?" she pressed, trying to probe his feelings without being too direct. He shook his head, looking sad. "Sometimes the past is like a weight that doesn't go away. Some choices can't be undone." Richard seemed lost in memories she couldn't see, but with every word he confirmed more of the truth Camille already knew. He had abandoned her, and now he stood before her, unaware. The young doctor took a deep breath, trying not to show the emotion building inside her. "Richard, and about your wife, Evelyn? What was your relationship like?" she asked, doing her best to sound natural while emotions surged within her. Richard, distracted by his own thoughts, answered without realizing the intensity of the question. "She meant everything to me. I never thought I could love someone like that. And when she left, I lost everything, including what could have been." He interrupted the sentence as if still trying to avoid the reality of having left his daughter behind. Camille felt tears press against her eyes but maintained her composure. She felt anger, hurt, and love intertwine inside her, creating a whirlwind of emotions that left her on the verge of exploding. She wanted to scream, confront him, ask why he had abandoned her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she continued to watch him, trying to understand how a father who had left his own child could now appear so vulnerable. "Are you all right, Camille?" Richard asked, noticing the change in her expression. Camille quickly looked away, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying the pain she tried to hide. She was a step away from confronting him, but she didn't know how to face the truth without losing herself in her own emotions. She needed more time to process everything, but Richard's proximity only heightened the tension she felt. Will Camille finally find the courage to reveal the truth to Richard? Or will the fear of the past and the weight of abandonment keep father and daughter apart? The cafe near the hospital was where Camille usually found refuge on difficult days, but that afternoon, even the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the murmur of conversations in the background felt oppressive. Sitting at a corner table, she waited for Megan, her best friend since medical school. When Megan finally arrived and sat down across from her, Camille let out a heavy sigh, unable to hide the tension that consumed her. "Camille, what's going on? You look devastated," Megan said, concern etched on her face. Camille merely shook her head, trying to muster the strength to begin. "I just found out something that changed everything," she said, feeling tears threatening to spill. She paused, attempting to regain her composure. "Remember I told you about Richard, my rehabilitation patient, the one with whom I felt an inexplicable connection?" Megan nodded, her eyes attentive and patient, giving Camille the space to continue. "Well, he is my father, the man who abandoned me when I was a baby." The words came out as a whisper, yet the weight of them seemed to fill the room. Megan's eyes widened, speechless. "Camille, are you sure?" Megan asked, reaching across the table to hold her hand. Camille confirmed with a nod, fighting back tears. "I don't know how to deal with this," Camille admitted, her voice trembling. "On one hand, I admire him. I want to keep getting to know him. He regrets it, Megan. I can see that. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about how he gave up on me. He should have been my protector, my family. And he left." Megan squeezed her hand firmly. "I understand your pain, but there's only one way to get through this, Camille. Be honest with him. Tell him who you are." Camille shook her head, a wave of fear washing over her. "What if he rejects me again? I don't know if I can go through that." Her words echoed, bringing to the surface the open wound she carried. The image of Richard in her mind was conflicting. He was the man she admired as a patient, someone who seemed to have truly changed, but he was also the father who had abandoned her. Megan watched her in silence, knowing Camille needed to resolve this internal struggle before making a decision. And while she herself knew what she would do, only Camille could decide if she would confront Richard. A few days later, during a physical therapy session, Camille found herself once again beside Richard. She was visibly tenser, but tried to hide it. That day, Richard seemed especially quiet, lost in thought as he struggled to perform the exercises with her help. "Richard, are you okay?" she asked, using her usual professional tone, but feeling the question was deeply personal. Richard took a deep breath, his gaze weary. He knew that the young doctor assisting him also carried some anguish within her, but he had always respected the boundaries between patient and professional. In that moment, however, the barrier between them seemed unnecessary. "I was thinking about choices I made in the past, things I can never undo." Camille paused for a moment, his words hitting her with a weight he could not imagine. She encouraged him to continue, not knowing if she was ready to hear what he had to say, but unable to contain her curiosity. "Years ago, Camille, I did something I could never forgive myself for," he confessed, avoiding her gaze. "When my wife died, I was lost, shattered, and I left a daughter behind, my daughter. I thought I was doing what was best for her, that I couldn't be the father she needed." His voice faltered, and he paused, rubbing his face with his hand. Camille felt tears welling up. Hearing those words from him, without him knowing who she truly was, felt like a knife to her heart. "Do you think if you had a second chance, you would do it differently?" She struggled to keep her voice steady. Richard remained silent for a few seconds, pondering his answer. "Every day of my life, Camille. I would give anything to go back in time and fix what I did. But some things can't be forgiven, and I think I don't deserve that." Camille looked away, discreetly wiping away a tear that had rolled down her cheek. She loved him and hated him at the same time. His voice carried genuine regret, but the pain of being abandoned was profound. Each word he spoke reinforced her internal conflict. A part of her wanted to forgive him, but the other couldn't forget the abandonment. She longed to tell him the truth in that moment, to reveal everything and end the anguish that separated them. But seeing his expression made her hesitate. The fear of him reacting negatively paralyzed her, and she simply nodded in silence, holding his hand in a gesture that mixed empathy and pain. After that physical therapy session, Camille couldn't stop thinking about Richard's revelation. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but she needed to find a way to confront everything she felt. She decided to write a letter. Perhaps by putting everything on paper, she could finally face the situation head-on. That night, locked away in her office, Camille sat down at the table with a blank sheet and began to write, pouring out every thought and feeling she had kept bottled up for so long. The letter grew more intense with each line, blending the words she wished she could say to him but couldn't. In her words, she expressed the affection she had developed for him, the respect for the man he had become, but also the pain she felt for being abandoned by him. "Richard," she wrote, "I am your daughter, the one you left behind, the one you thought you couldn't love enough. I know you regret it, and maybe one day I will be able to forgive you. But today, I just need you to know how much this has affected me, how I had to fight to become who I am, despite you giving up on me." Each sentence seemed to lift a weight she had carried for years. She felt she was preparing for a confrontation, a catharsis that would free her from doubts and hurt. When she finished, she carefully folded the letter, placing it in an envelope with Richard's name on the front. Finally, she had the truth ready for him in the form of a letter. The next day, she took the envelope with her to Richard's room. When she entered, he greeted her with a smile, but she felt a pang of anxiety as she remembered the contents of the envelope in her pocket. His voice was calm, and for a moment, she almost had the courage to hand him the letter. She looked at him, and the instant their eyes met, her hand trembled. Something in Richard's serenity disarmed her, and the fear of being rejected again overwhelmed her. He looked at her like someone dear, someone she could trust, and the thought of shattering that peace with a painful revelation felt unbearable. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but instead of handing him the letter, she decided to tuck it back into her pocket. It wasn't the moment yet, she told herself. Maybe there would be another opportunity for that truth to come out. She didn't want to risk the bond they had built so far, even if it was built on a lie. As she left the room, she felt the anguish intensifying. The truth was getting closer, but fear continued to prevent her from confessing. She knew she couldn't postpone this revelation forever. With each passing day, the secret consumed her, and the moment of confession became inevitable. How long can Camille keep this secret from Richard? The confrontation is getting closer, and the revelation will bring irreversible consequences. The night was silent in Camille's apartment, but her mind was in complete turmoil. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m, yet she showed no signs of sleep. She sat on the living room floor, the letter she had written to Richard clutched in her hands. The small room, usually her refuge, felt cramped, as if the walls were closing in around her. Each word of the letter echoed in her mind, but the weight of delivering it felt insurmountable. She looked at the envelope with his name written in her handwriting, knowing that this simple piece of paper had the power to change everything. The relationship they had built, the closeness that had sprung from nowhere, it could all disappear if Richard reacted poorly. But how could she continue beside him without telling the truth? "Why did he leave me?" Camille whispered, her voice faltering as tears streamed down her face. It was a question that had echoed in her mind ever since she discovered who Richard truly was. She had heard his version of events, the regret he carried, but that didn't erase the pain she felt from being abandoned. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to find some solace in the solitude of the night. Doubt consumed her. If she told the truth, she might lose the only real connection she had created with the man who had abandoned her. But if she didn't, she would remain trapped in this cycle of lies and half-truths, always on the brink of a confession that never came. She glanced at the letter once more and in an impulsive act nearly tore the envelope in half, but stopped short. She knew the truth would need to come out sooner or later. The pain in her chest was palpable, and the decision she needed to make was drawing ever closer. The following afternoon, the sun shone brightly in a clear sky, with no sign of the dark clouds that haunted Camille's thoughts. Richard had invited her for a walk in the nearby park, an attempt to leave the hospital environment behind, even if just for a few hours. The park was calm with few people around, and the gentle breeze rustling through the trees created an atmosphere of peace. But for Camille, the outing was far from tranquil. As she pushed Richard's wheelchair, he began to speak more about his past choices. The tone of his voice was heavy with regret, but also a desperate attempt at redemption. "I regret many things," Richard started, looking at the horizon, avoiding Camille's gaze. "Especially about my daughter. When I left her, I thought I was doing what was best for her, that I wasn't capable of taking care of her, that she would be better off without me." Richard's words pierced Camille's heart like knives. She felt the air leave her lungs for a moment but kept walking beside him, trying to maintain her composure. Her hands gripped the wheelchair's handles tighter than usual. "I should have fought," Richard continued, regret evident in every word. "But now it's too late. I wonder every day how she is, who she has become. If I could just see her one more time, ask for forgiveness." He paused, his voice choked. Camille felt her heart break. His words cut deeply, mixing the anger and desire for forgiveness she felt. It was as if everything he said was directed at her, and with each phrase, she felt the confession ready to spill from her lips. But at the same time, something held her back. The walk continued in silence for a few minutes, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Camille desperately wanted to scream the truth at him, but the fear of rejection and losing the bond they had built loomed larger. As they walked, she looked at Richard and saw not just the father who had abandoned her, but the remorseful man who wanted a second chance. Yet the uncertainty of how he would react kept her trapped in a painful cycle of silence. Later that day, the tranquility of the park was replaced by a violent storm. The sky suddenly darkened, and thunder rumbled throughout the city. Camille and Richard were back at the clinic when the rain began to pelt heavily against the windows. The storm was so intense that eventually, the clinic suffered a power outage, leaving everything in dimness. Emergency generators kept some equipment running, but the power was unstable. Camille was with Richard in the lobby when they decided to take the elevator back to his room. With the blackout, the elevator seemed the safest choice, given Richard's physical limitations. However, halfway up, the power completely failed, and the elevator stopped abruptly. "Great," Camille murmured, trying to hide her apprehension. They were trapped in the dark. The only audible sound was the distant echo of the storm outside and the low hum of the failing generator. Richard sighed, his soft voice cutting through the silence. "You know, being stuck in a dark place seems like an appropriate metaphor for my life." Camille turned slightly, unable to see his face but feeling the weight of his statement. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, even as the internal turmoil swelled. "I've lived so long in the dark," he confessed, his voice laden with emotion. "I've always hidden from my own mistakes, especially when it came to my daughter. I never managed to forgive myself for leaving her. It's the biggest regret of my life, and knowing I'll never have the chance to correct it. It destroys me." His words resonated in the enclosed space, and Camille felt her anguish growing within her. They were in darkness, trapped, and everything he said seemed to suffocate her. It was as if each word was opening a deep wound, one she had tried to hide for so long. "If I could just see her, just once," Richard continued, his voice almost a whisper. "To ask for forgiveness for being so weak, for not being the father she deserved." Camille couldn't hold back her tears any longer. In the dark, she finally allowed her emotions to spill over. Her body shook with silent sobs, but Richard couldn't see, didn't know how much those words were destroying her. "Do you think she could forgive you?" Camille asked, her voice breaking, unsure if the question was meant for him or for herself. "I don't know," Richard replied, the pain in his voice as real as the sound of the storm outside. "But I would give anything to try." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Camille knew she was on the brink of a revelation. What more could she say to him in that moment? The confrontation she had feared seemed inevitable, and the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her. Trapped in the elevator in the dark, with his words echoing, Camille felt she could no longer keep the secret. The truth was about to explode. Will Camille finally find the courage to reveal the truth to Richard, trapped in the dark with him? The storm outside reflects the turmoil within her, and the moment of confession seems closer than ever.
If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment on what you think so far. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any episodes. Your interaction is essential for our channel to grow and bring even more moving content. Now let's get back to the story.
In the darkness of the stalled elevator, the tension between Camille and Richard was palpable. The sound of the storm outside was muted, but the thunder still vibrated through the small space, amplifying the weight of the words that were about to come. Camille felt her heart racing, as if it might explode right out of her chest. She knew this was the moment, the only moment possible to tell the truth. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Her voice came out as a broken whisper, but the words were unmistakable. "Richard, it's me. I am your daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. The words echoed in the elevator, as if the small enclosed space amplified the truth and hurled it directly into Richard's heart. Camille almost regretted it immediately. She held her breath, waiting for his reaction, unsure of what to expect. There was no immediate response. She could only hear his breathing, which seemed as shaky as her own. Camille felt each second stretch into an eternity. She tried to decipher what Richard might be thinking, but it was too dark to see his expression. Was he in shock? Angry? In silence, she braced herself for the worst, ready to hear whatever he might say, even if the words cut her deeply. The weight was unbearable. The revelation had finally been made, but Richard's response remained hidden in the dark silence of the elevator. When the maintenance team finally pried open the doors of the elevator, Camille and Richard stepped out into the clinic's hallway. Richard, still in shock, looked more fragile than ever. His eyes were fixed on Camille, filled with a mixture of disbelief and vulnerability. It was as if he were seeing a ghost, a vision he never expected to witness. Camille paused, her heart heavy, watching every expression on Richard's face, trying to understand what he felt. His face showed a whirlwind of emotions. He appeared hesitant, almost lost, as if the words he had just heard were still echoing in his mind. Richard brought a hand to his face, trying to hold back tears, but he failed. The truth was overwhelming. He began to cry silently, tears streaming down his face without any effort to hide them. Camille felt his pain as if it were her own, and even though she didn't know what to say or do, she took a step toward him, her hands trembling. Richard, however, seemed unable to move. He reached out to her, but hesitated midway, as if the distance between them were insurmountable. He looked uncertain, as if he believed he had no right to touch her, as if he feared the bond they had formed over the past few weeks was crumbling. Yet Camille could no longer contain her impulse. The pain and regret in his eyes spoke more than any apology could express. She extended her hand and grasped his firmly. A heavy silence settled between them, but at that moment, the physical contact between father and daughter said everything they both needed to hear. They stood like that in silence until Richard, still dazed, asked in a shaky voice, his eyes filled with questions, "Camille, how did you know? How did you find out I was your father?" Camille looked at him, trying to hold back her tears. "It was by chance. Papers at the hospital, old information. I never expected it to be you." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything left to say. But upon hearing your story, I knew I couldn't run away from the truth. Richard's gaze showed an understanding mingled with profound pain as he absorbed each word, realizing how she had been by his side without revealing anything. Later, still shaken by the revelation, Richard and Camille walked in silence to the garden of the clinic. The storm had subsided, and the sky was now only covered with scattered clouds, revealing a few stars that shone timidly. The night seemed to offer a bit of peace, a truce for the turbulent hearts of father and daughter. Richard paused beside a tree, leaning against a nearby bench, while Camille sat down next to him, feeling the weight of the night and everything that still needed to be said. The sound of water dripping from the leaves after the rain filled the air, creating a calm, almost solemn atmosphere. Richard took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. He looked at Camille, and the pain in his eyes was evident, but there was also deep remorse. Camille, I spent all these years believing I would never see you again, and at some point I think I convinced myself that you were better off without me, but I never forgave myself for leaving you. His voice faltered, and he looked down at the ground, shame and guilt overflowing in every word. Camille felt her chest tighten upon hearing Richard's sincerity. Each word seemed to carry years of suffering he had kept to himself. Tears welled up again, but this time she didn't hold them back. I spent so much time wondering why, Dad. Why did you leave me? Why weren't you there? The word Dad slipped from her lips almost without her realizing it, but it felt unexpectedly relieving. Richard swallowed hard, clearly emotional at hearing her call him Dad. He reached for her hand again, and this time he didn't hesitate. He held her hand tightly, as if fearing she would disappear if he loosened his grip. Camille, I am so sorry. There hasn't been a day that I haven't thought of you, of who you would have become, and every day I regretted it a little more. I would give anything to go back, to change what I did. Camille looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, feeling a huge weight lift. Years of pain, resentment, and unanswered questions seemed to finally find some closure. I forgive you, Dad, she said, her voice heavy with emotion but also with sincere acceptance. Camille's words were like a release. They echoed in the air, dissipating the tension that surrounded them. Richard felt the tears stream down his face, but this time they were not from regret, but from relief. He pulled Camille into a tight embrace, as if making up for all the lost years. And she embraced him back, allowing herself to feel the affection she had always longed for, but believed she had lost forever. Father and daughter stood there, embraced under the night sky, their hearts finally at peace. The reconciliation was more powerful than any words could express. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and all that existed was the love they had fought to find. But will Camille and Richard be able to rebuild what was lost after forgiveness? The path of father and daughter is finally united, but new challenges may still arise. The therapy room at the clinic was silent, a welcoming serenity enveloping Richard and Camille. Family therapy sessions had become a routine over the past few weeks, helping them confront the wounds of their past together. It was difficult to open up, but there, in each other's presence and that of the therapist, they managed to voice years of pain and resentment they had both carried in silence. Richard held his hands on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor, before finally breaking the silence. The pain of abandoning you has always loomed over me. The truth is, even after distancing myself, I've never stopped blaming myself for not being there for you. Camille listened intently, absorbing every word. She knew the weight of those confessions, and seeing her father so vulnerable, shedding layers of pride and guilt, deeply touched her heart. I spent so much time imagining what it would be like if you were present, what kind of father you would be, and at the same time I felt anger. I thought I could never forgive you, Camille said, her voice trembling. The therapist encouraged them to explore these feelings sincerely, asking Richard to share how he viewed Camille today. He lifted his gaze, studying his daughter's face, and a look of pride emerged on his features. "You are everything I could have ever imagined. Strong, determined, kind. I know that came from you, not from me. I wasn't there to guide you." Camille interrupted, holding his hand. "But you're here now. That's what matters." The session ended with a shared glance between them that was deeper than any words. They left the room, both exhausted but feeling a sense of relief, as if they had finally lifted a weight off their shoulders. With the idea of a trip to the countryside in mind, Richard took care of all the details. He chose a secluded cabin, a tranquil refuge that would give them the space needed to reflect and reconnect. Upon arrival, the fresh air and the silence of the place welcomed them. The rustic living room was illuminated only by the soft light of the fireplace, and the crackling sound of the burning wood created a serene atmosphere. That night, Camille watched her father, sensing he still carried something deeply painful within him. Sitting beside him, she encouraged him to talk about someone who had always been a mystery in her life, his mother, Evelyn. "Dad, you hardly ever talk about Mom. What was she really like?" Camille asked, a mix of curiosity and longing for a person she had never known. Richard took a deep breath, surprised by the question. He hesitated for a moment, but upon meeting Camille's gaze, he decided it was time to share. "Evelyn, she was the most vibrant person I ever met. When she entered a room, it felt as if the world around her lit up. She was sweet but incredibly strong. She knew what she wanted and valued the present above all." As he spoke, Richard seemed to lose himself in memories, his gaze focused on the fire. Camille listened in silence, absorbing every detail. She found herself imagining what Evelyn was like, the woman who was so significant to her father and who, even in her absence, seemed to be so present. Life with her was light, while I worried about the future, about what I could offer her, and Evelyn focused on enjoying the moment. She laughed easily, loved the little things in life. The sound of her laughter, it kept me going on many tough days. With tears in her eyes, Camille saw the love Richard still held for his wife. The father sitting beside her, finally revealing himself completely, was more human and vulnerable than she had ever imagined. That night was not just about reconnecting with him, but also about getting to know the mother who, in a way, was also part of that moment. The next morning, as they packed their bags to return to London, Richard paused, looking at Camille with a thoughtful expression. In a hesitant gesture, he took a small photo from his wallet and handed it to her. It was an old photo of Camille as a baby, with an innocent smile. The image was worn, the edges yellowed with time, but the light in Camille's eyes sparkled with the same sweetness he saw now. "I kept this photo very carefully. When you were born, I took this one picture before everything changed." Richard's voice was choked, and he seemed lost in memories as he continued to hold the photo delicately. Camille, touched by the revelation, held the photo close to her heart. That image was proof that, even from a distance, he had never forgotten her. With each passing year, he kept that memory, a reminder of what he had lost, but also of the love that still existed. This was a moment of full reconciliation, and they both felt it. Camille said nothing, but leaned in towards her father and hugged him, feeling the weight of everything he had endured and all the love that, at last, she could feel. Tears streamed down silently, but they were tears of relief, of a love that finally found space to exist. In the silence of that embrace, both understood that, despite the passage of time and the existence of suffering, true love remained, invisible but always present. Months had passed since Richard and Camille returned from the country house. Richard's mansion, once marked by silence and emptiness, was now coming to life with Camille's constant presence. She spent more time with her father, cherishing the small moments that had previously seemed impossible. Gradually, the cold solitude surrounding Richard began to melt away under the new relationship between them, transforming the house into a home. On a crisp autumn morning, Richard was preparing coffee in the kitchen, something he had never done before but had learned from Camille. She walked in just as he was arranging 2 mugs. "You're becoming quite the expert at this, Dad," she teased, pulling out a chair as he poured the coffee. Richard laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent times. Over sips of coffee and casual conversation, they talked about Camille's work, the hobbies Richard had rediscovered, and small plans for the future. Normalcy felt almost strange to both of them, but there was something profoundly moving in it. Each moment, each conversation was an opportunity to get to know each other better and strengthen the bond that had been lost for so long. "Have you thought about taking a trip? Just the 2 of us to celebrate this new phase?" Richard suggested, his eyes bright with excitement. He was not only rediscovering his daughter, but also a new version of himself, more open, more willing to embrace the present. Camille smiled, surprised by the suggestion. The idea of creating new memories with her father, something so simple and genuine, filled her heart with joy. "I think that's perfect. How about somewhere in France? I've always wanted to see the countryside." The suggestion made Richard smile even more, although he kept a secret to himself. "France, I like that idea." He nodded, but held on to the plans he had been crafting for some time. At that moment, the idea of a new life felt more real and possible than ever. That afternoon was special. Richard and Camille organized a lunch at a cozy restaurant in Notting Hill, surrounded by friends and loved ones. The table was filled with laughter and conversations, with Richard and Camille at the center, appearing closer than ever. It was the first time in years that Richard allowed himself to be surrounded by people, showing vulnerability alongside the daughter he had fought so hard to reconnect with. As the lunch neared its end, Richard stood up and asked for everyone's attention. He held a glass of wine, and the look he gave Camille was filled with emotion. "I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has been with me during the toughest times. But today especially, I want to thank Camille." Camille felt tears welling in her eyes as she listened to her father's words. He seemed more serene, more at peace than she had ever seen him. Richard continued, his voice low and sincere. "For many years I was a man focused only on achievements and responsibilities. But Camille, you've given me the greatest second chance anyone could hope for. I thought the past was impossible to remedy, but you proved that forgiveness can bring light even to the darkest moments." The friends around them applauded, and Camille, visibly moved, raised her glass as well in a silent toast to the future they were building. The energy around them was pure happiness, but what touched Camille the most was the sincerity in Richard's words. She knew how hard he had fought against his own demons to get to this point. It was a moment of complete reconciliation, of understanding and relief for both. After the toast, Richard sat down again, and the 2 exchanged a silent glance, filled with meaning. That lunch represented much more than a celebration. It was proof that the past was no longer a burden, but a story overcome that now strengthened the relationship between father and daughter. Later that day, the sun was setting when Richard and Camille decided to take a walk in the park. The stroll was peaceful, unhurried. The gentle breeze and the distant rustling of leaves created a perfect backdrop. They chatted about little things, laughing, sharing confidences, as if they were old friends rediscovering each other's company. Suddenly, Richard stopped and, smiling a little mysteriously, reached into his coat pocket. Camille looked at him curiously, waiting for something she couldn't quite guess. "I've been planning this for a few months," he began, extending an envelope to her. Camille took the envelope, furrowing her brow. Upon opening it, she found 2 plane tickets and a set of documents. She quickly read the contents of the official letter from the French government and was left speechless. Richard watched her closely, waiting for her reaction with an eager smile. A vineyard in France?" Camille finally said, surprised and visibly moved. She looked up at him, confused and delighted at the same time. Dad, you bought a vineyard? Richard nodded, holding his daughter's hand firmly. I wanted something more than just a trip. I wanted to create a new beginning for both of us. I thought maybe we could go to the French countryside, start over in a completely new way. The vineyard will be ours, Camille. A place for us to work together, to build something that is ours. I want you to be a part of it all, as a partner, as my daughter, as my family. Camille felt tears streaming down her face, unable to contain her emotion. The idea of a fresh start, of a peaceful life alongside her father, was something she had never imagined possible. Richard, the man who had spent his life chasing achievements and success, was now offering her what she had always longed for: a family and a life filled with meaning and love. She hugged him tightly, feeling that finally the cycle of pain and regret had come to an end. Thank you, Dad, for everything. Let's start over, together. With the promise of that future, father and daughter left the park hand in hand, ready for a life they had never imagined. The south of France welcomed Richard and Camille as an unfamiliar yet profoundly warm home. A year had passed since they left London behind, trading the frantic pace and pressures of the city for the tranquility of the countryside. The vineyard they now managed was a simple endeavor, yet for both it symbolized the rebuilding of their relationship. Camille had traded her white lab coat for jeans and boots. The days of work were long but intensely rewarding. She spent hours among the rows of vines, learning about grape cultivation, getting to know each plant as if it were part of her own being. The work brought her closer to her father in a way she had never imagined before. Richard, on the other hand, found himself surprised each new day. He, who had always been a businessman focused on numbers and profits, was now learning to appreciate the flavor of simplicity. Each task at the vineyard was a new lesson and an opportunity to strengthen the bond with Camille. They worked side by side, smiling, sharing memories from the past, and making plans for the future. The vineyard had become more than just a workplace. It was the foundation of a renewed life. I never imagined I could be this happy, Richard remarked one day, his eyes surveying the vineyards that stretched to the horizon. I spent my life searching for something, and now I realize it was all within my reach. Camille smiled, feeling her heart lighten. There, beside Richard, she had found something beyond what she could have expected: the love of a father and the joy of starting anew. The weight of the lost years no longer mattered, for the present was filled with hope. That afternoon the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the vineyards. Richard and Camille walked in silence, feeling the earth beneath their feet and the aroma of the vines. The grapes were nearly ripe, ready for harvest, and the field exuded the sweet scent of the promise of good wine. Richard paused for a moment, observing the fruits of their hard work alongside Camille. He turned to her with a look of tenderness and gratitude. I never imagined such a simple place could bring me so much peace, but you gave me this chance, the fresh start I could never have found on my own. Camille squeezed her father's hand, feeling the weight of his words. It was you who took the first step, Dad. I was just waiting to find you. The sincerity in her voice was evident, and the two exchanged a glance that required no further words. The simplicity of the moment was overwhelming. Father and daughter, after so many years of separation, were there, at peace, feeling the deep connection of those who chose to forgive and love. Richard's decision to swap his corporate life for something more authentic and connected to nature represented the perfect conclusion to a journey of redemption. They had found a home in the vineyards and in the shared memories. Richard's choice, more than anything, symbolized the love he now embraced, without fear or reservations. He was not just living a new reality. He was building a life alongside Camille, based on moments that truly mattered. Months passed, and the big day of the harvest finally arrived. It was the moment Camille and Richard had worked hard for over the past year, and to celebrate, they organized a party at the vineyard. They invited neighbors, friends, and those who had become part of their new life over the last year. The party was simple but filled with joy. Tables were adorned with wildflowers and the aroma of freshly produced wine hung in the air. Laughter and conversation filled the atmosphere, creating a scene of celebration and belonging. Camille walked among the guests, chatting and handing out glasses of wine with a smile that revealed the happiness of someone who had finally found her place. In the midst of the celebration, Richard called for everyone's attention and, with a glass of wine in hand, made a brief speech. He looked at Camille, who watched him with pride, and smiled. Today, we are not just celebrating the harvest of our vineyard. We are celebrating the life that Camille and I have built together. It has been a long journey, full of ups and downs, but it has brought me the greatest gift I could receive, the forgiveness and love of my daughter. Camille felt her eyes welling up with tears as she listened to her father's words. She never imagined she would see Richard so open and sincere, and there, among the friends and family they chose to build, she felt completely at peace. The harvest of that wine was, for them, more than a celebration of success. It was the mark of a new era in their lives. Richard raised his glass, and everyone toasted. He and Camille exchanged a look, each recognizing how much that moment represented. It was not just a victory over the past, but the beginning of a life full of possibilities. In that toast, the weight of the past had vanished, leaving only gratitude for the present and for the journey they still had ahead. And so, in the vineyards of southern France, father and daughter found what they had both been searching for, a renewed life, built on love, redemption, and purpose. Because sometimes, all we need to start anew is a second chance.
After so many challenges and twists, father and daughter found something far more valuable than material wealth: the power of forgiveness and the importance of love and family bonds. Their journey reminds us that sometimes life's hardest decisions can lead to deep transformations. Each moment lost is a chance to reflect on what truly matters and how the strength of love can guide us to a fresh start. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you had the chance to correct a mistake from the past? And what did you think of today's story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications to catch our upcoming videos, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. This really helps our channel grow and motivates us to bring you more heartfelt stories. Be sure to check out the next recommended video by clicking the card now on the screen. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.